Hello again. We're back with another Wild Roof podcast episode. And today we have writer Michael Engelhard and a bunch of interesting things to get into as usual. First and foremost, Michael is the author of the new book called No Place Like Nome, the Bering Strait Seen Through Its Most Storied City. So we will get into that book a little bit. Um, but just to give you kind of the basic intro for Michael, I'll read a little bit of his background. Trained as an anthropologist with a degree from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Michael worked for 25 years as a wilderness guide and outdoor instructor in Alaska and on the Colorado Plateau. The editor of 4 anthologies and author of Ice Bear, The Cultural History of an Arctic Icon. Other books include Arctic Traverse, as well as What the River Knows, Essays from the Heart of Alaska, as well as the Grand Canyon essay collection, No Walk in the Park. So that's a couple of your books, a couple of the many books that you've been involved with. And like I said, the new one, No Place Like Nome. So before we get into the books specifically, I'd like to get a little bit of the who you are and where you come from part. So where are you from originally? And maybe we could add on the like how did Alaska become part of your journey? If we can wrap those into one question, go for
I'll try to answer that as
it.
succinctly as I can. Thanks for having me on the show, by the way. Yeah, I moved from Germany in 1989, just a month before the wall came down, and I have not been back since. So I hear the country's changed quite a bit, but without me. And the reason was books, actually, because you might say too much Jack London at a susceptible age. So I always for the longest time been wanting to live up north in Canada or Alaska. And, life has a funny way of working out. Long story short, I ended up becoming an anthropology student at Munich in Germany and specialized on northern Athabascan people, which are the Indian people, so to speak, that live in the interior of Canada and Alaska, and decided, well, I really need to meet these people in order to get to know them and learn from them. And so I applied for a scholarship. And originally it was going to be only a 1 year exchange student program with the University of Fairbanks, but I really liked the program and they liked me. And I fell head over heels in love with Alaska. How could you not? And, they got me visa changed and a teaching and a research position. And I stayed, and the rest, is my life as a writer. That was the only writing I had done up to that point, was only academic writing.
Yeah, excellent. I guess you mentioned Jack London. Was that kind of your first exposure to kind of the wilderness, nature, that kind of
Uh,
writing?
Reading, I always was attracted to that sort of literature, and maybe had to do with the fact that my parents, when we were kids, they took us into the mountains a lot, and me and my brother. And so then later I joined the military, became a paratrooper, and we spent a lot of time in the woods, crawling around, getting dirty. So all those were formative experiences. And then I did one vacation, actually. I went to Scandinavia, north of the Arctic Circle, into Norway and Finland, and another one where I traveled from the interior of Canada, from Edmonton to Vancouver. And so I really liked what I saw there. And I had in 82, actually, I was hitchhiking for half a year through the United States, the Southwest, ended up down in Mexico and Canada. And I had some experiences with Native American people, including a Hopi family on Second Mesa that took me in for a few days, that really, really re-sparked this interest in other cultures and basically led me to enrolling as an anthropology student in Munich later on.
So I guess it might be useful. Nome, Alaska isn't maybe, visually on everybody's radar, I guess geographically speaking, like where is it on the map? So just to kind of cover a little bit of the basics, it's on essentially the coast of the Bering Strait, um, in the extreme western portion of Alaska.
That's
And
right.
it's basically the closest place where it meets the extreme eastern part of Siberia. Um, and so what was it about Nome? How did even Alaska's huge, of course, and Nome is very small. And I just looked up before coming on. I guess I could throw this tidbit. The recorded population of Nome, Alaska was 3,700, at
Yes.
least in 2020. Um, so that gives you a sense of the scale. So yeah, how did Nome become part of the journey,
So,
specifically?
so the narrowest part of the Bering Strait there is actually 56 miles, and there are places where you can see Russia from the mainland. I have had some roots that go back to my time as an anthropology student when I was doing I was part of a multi-year study that was conducted for the Park Service, and we were doing land use and subsistence research in Northwest Alaska. And so, not specifically Nome, but the area a little north of there, Kotzebue. Uh, I knew that already. And then in 2011, my wife, we were living in Fairbanks at the time, and my wife, who's a public nurse, public health nurse for the state of Alaska, she got a job in Nome, and it was just too irresistible, to not take it up. And she ended up doing some really incredible stuff, including flying out to the islands in the Bering Strait there and, servicing people there. And I was a wilderness guide in the Brooks Range, which isn't too far from Nome at the time. And so that's how we ended up spending a few years there. It is a backwater. It is even to a lot of Alaskans, it's a backwater, but that wasn't always the case. It was really a central hub between two continents where there was a lot of trade between native Siberians and native Alaskans. And then also because historically, the gold rush, was the largest settlement with the oldest newspaper still in existence at the time in 1899 when the gold strike was discovered there. And you should not make the mistake with Nome to mistake its size, its physical size, with its importance. I've had a guy say, well, why would I be interested in Nome? I have a website that has more followers than Nome has residents, right? But it had this hub function, and it will again be a hotspot. I can guarantee you that with the Northwest Passage now from Europe being ice free, there's a lot of traffic coming over that, tourists from Europe, and they're building a deep water port in Nome because of the geopolitical situation right now, the things heating up with Russia, and then the race also for Arctic resources. So I would bet my life that before long the Nome is going to be in the limelight again, and I hope so because that'll help sell the book, of course.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, so I was gonna ask, what is Nome like today? I mean, have you, when's the most recent, I guess, firsthand experience you've had there? And yeah, just to kind of set the scene a little bit, like what would a traveler find there today?
It's interesting in a lot of ways. One of them is that its look. It's geographically it's at the same latitude as Fairbanks, so it's not Arctic, but it does look Arctic because you're out of the tree line there. The tree line peters out as you go west in Alaska. You go toward the coast, so it really has this Arctic feeling. And once in the blue moon, you see that in the fauna too. There's musk oxen. There's a herd of musk oxen that hangs out right in town sometimes, and once in a while you get a polar bear stranded too. So it's that geographic, biologic, um, marginal position where it connects different environments, and also culturally, like it's just on the border between the two biggest Alaskan Eskimo groups, the Inupiaq and the Yupik. So culturally, it's very interesting. Plus, you get the Anglo culture in there, and it's an interesting mix between the past and the present. It has modern features, but also there are traditions that go back thousands of years. And the land that Nome sits on, the treeless tundra that it sits on, is actually a physical remnant of Beringia. It's that lost continent, more commonly known as the Bering Land Bridge, across which, of course, the first immigrants, so to speak, North American Indians and Eskimos came from, with origins in Northeast Asia. So it's a really important area for both Americas, North and South America. And you still find a lot of artifacts that are thousands of years old. Archaeologists find spear points that are 12,000 years old or older at places where people are still hunting caribou at river crossings where they did that in the late Pleistocene. And you also find lots of mammoth bones, tusks, sticking out of the riverbank when it rains or when the ice goes out. So it's an awesome combination between the really, really old and the new and modern. And what makes it special is also that it's one of those places which doesn't make it special for Alaska, but special for most people outside, that it's off the road system. You know, it has 3 roads taken all together, I think 75 miles of road, but they're not going anywhere connected to the major road system in Alaska. And so it
Wow.
creates this island mentality. But what most interests me to know in Nome as a writer is, as the subtitle of the book says, it's the Bering Strait's most storied city, and maybe even Alaska's most storied city. I've lived in a lot of interesting places throughout the years in Alaska and also in the lower 48, but Nome, as far as stories, or at least the kind of stories that interest me, it really has every other city or town that I've lived in beaten. I always compare it to a set of Russian dolls where one story nests within another, and you never get to the bottom of it. You know, there's more than a lifetime's worth of material there for a writer.
That's funny. Yeah, I was going to bring up, there's a line in the introduction of the book, and it says, Nome in its heyday enticed misfits, dreamers, the colorful, fabulists. So would that be the gold rush? Is that heyday?
Yeah, that's when Nome was put on the map for most Western people. You know, the official history for most people when they think about Nome starts in 1899. But it was important for me in this collection to show that that's just the scratching the surface. You know, and so I tried to include the native stories as much as humanly possible, which is of course where my background as an anthropologist and my work in the region really came in handily.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of a unique feature, is like if people are trying to get away, you can't go any further, I suppose. Um, so yeah, that kind of makes sense. Um, but yeah, maybe even yeah, maybe speaking to the personalities. One section of the book is featured on personalities. Maybe you can share one of the personalities that you wrote about in the book.
Well, you always the fun part about doing the research for nonfiction is that you always learn new things yourself. And a big part of the joy that I had in researching and writing the book was the discovery of a new writer, a nature writer. And since I'm a nature writer myself, that was a big deal. And I'd never even heard of her. And it turns out, in my opinion, after reading some of her work, the name is Sally Cargar, that she's as good a writer as maybe Rachel Carson or Aldo Leopold, with whom she was a contemporary. The difference why she never made it that big, in my mind, is that her writing's apolitical. She didn't take any stance pro-environment or pro-conservation. So she wrote these animal stories that are based on ethology, the science that was still young in the 40s, where about animal research about animal behavior. So she really researched, and then she puts herself into the shoes or into the paws of these animals and experiences the world and writes the world from the point of view of these animals without getting sentimental or sappy or anthropomorphic, which is really a hard thing to do. And so, to give an example, she bought this place in Nome, an old miner's house, and had it fitted specially to study lemmings. So she had some Eskimo workers build these microhabitats that looked like lemming burrows so that she could live with them and study them night and day. And most Nome people didn't understand what she was doing. They thought she was living with rats in that house. But she's a very good writer, and these characters, there's just dozens of them. There's Wyatt Earp, who owned a share in a saloon up there and used to go down to the beach and shoot at empty bottles. There's the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, who ended the first transpolar flight in a Zeppelin near Nome. And the locals, his navigator had to jump out of the Zeppelin with a parachute to get the thing anchored. It was so windy. And then the people, they scavenged the parachute, and the locals, they started making dresses out of it, silk dresses out of it for the women. So these characters and these events, that's the colorful part of Nome, really. You find a lot, and it still attracts that kind of personality, I think.
Well, you mentioned the research process, so I guess maybe that's an add-on. What was the research process like for this book? Or I mean, if you have like a larger pattern or thought process that you use for your research, maybe
Yeah,
you
I
could
had
share
over
some
the
of that.
years, I had written a lot of articles for various magazines about the area and about Nome. And the problem is that with those, you always beholden to the word count and to the style of a publication. And I'm an essayist by trade, and so it doesn't work too well, that style. It's too little, too highfalutin for a lot of these. I like Alaska Magazine and stuff, and I felt I had the material, and I also knew there was tons of more material, and everything was equally interesting. And so some of these articles that I had written, like for example about the reindeer industry that started in the 1910s on the Seward Peninsula around Nome. I had written articles about that, but I wanted to give it more and not be stuck with a X amount word count. And so some of those essays formed the core. And then I wrote more, and I organized them and structured them into those sections that the book is divided in now. And that basically was the core of the book.
Yeah, I was just actually looking. This might be a good place to um, offer one of your quotes. This was from a previous collection called "What the River Knows." So I'll read just a brief quote back to you, and then maybe you could add your thoughts to it, kind of centered on the essay form.
Uh-huh.
So the quote is, "I no longer believe essays, a purling, fluid, highly excursive form, became my passion and strength by coincidence or from a lack of staying power for longer projects. Their paragraphs digress like coils or may even switch channels to allow return to the overall course of an argument or theme. Their source isn't always obvious. Their destination, a sea of rest and tranquility or a mingling with other currents, sometimes surprises even myself."
And that's
So,
that,
yeah.
yeah, that's the nature, the explorator nature that I really enjoy, and the digressive nature too. I'm a chain thinker, so sometimes I think a thought, and then another thought hangs off of that, another one of that, and those are the meanders in the fluid form that the essay allows me to explore while always returning to the mainstream. And where it's not like a river is that these meanders can also be flashbacks or flash forwards in time, where I draw on previous experiences or other people's, or take a step into the future. So that's where it's a little different. But it's funny because I became a writer and an essayist by exploring and by walking. And I've actually written an essay where I explored the connections, the relationships between walking, thinking, writing, and memory. And there's physiological and neurological links actually where these things are connected. There's a Greek school of philosophers that discuss philosophical issues while walking. It stimulates certain parts of the brain and the breathing patterns and so on. It's just it's a very physical form of writing, actually. And the way I became a writer and an essayist was like 20 or so years ago. I read somewhere that when they dammed the Colorado River in with Glen Canyon Dam, what is now flooded Lake Powell, there were 120 canyons that were flooded or partially flooded. And that number kind of irked me because it was just a number. And I got, what does it mean? What does it mean? So one year I set out to explore 120 different canyons on the Colorado Plateau and just took notes and started journaling. And then I realized the damming was just one big act of environmental destruction. There was more going on where we're losing or compromising these places on a daily basis, anything from mining to cattle grazing to also, unfortunately, industrial tourism. And I thought maybe there's a story there that other people might be interested in. And so I tried to take these journal notes that I'd written and shape them into the book. But the problem was nobody wants to read about 120 canyons chronologically, right? And so after a number of rejections, I was forced to rethink my whole concept, and I decided to limit myself to maybe 12 settings from these canyons and hone each canyon hike, each exploration into an essay by focusing on a certain subject or theme. And that worked much better, of course, and eventually led to my first essay collection, my first published book, Where the Rain Children Sleep, a sacred geography of the Colorado Plateau. And ever since, I mean, I've dabbled in other forms, but I've written a memoir, like Arctic Traverse is a memoir of my traverse from the Canadian border to the Bering Strait, a 60 or 70-day trip. And even there, which I have it's chronological day by day, but in order to keep it interesting, I tried to turn each entry for each day into a sort of mini essay, and which in combination then makes for a memoir. And to me, that replicates life much better than this coherent narrative strand, which our lives aren't like that. There's a long time when you write a memoir, you never describe everything you did in a certain amount of time. You always pick and choose because there's a lot of times where nothing worth writing about happens. And so even a longer nonfiction work sometimes can be just a collection of essays that are somehow linked. And that's just how life is.
Yeah, it's always interesting when reading like a full-length work of nonfiction, whether it's, a collection of essays or a larger personal narrative, or like how the writer structures it. And so, yeah, there's things like, different cycle patterns, whether it's like a week or a year, or maybe you're taking like, there's a book I'm reading now, which each section is like a different element, like water,
Mm-hmm.
air, fire,
Right.
you know, and
And
so
sometimes
on.
I've had this pressure from publishers when I pitched essay collections. They're a hard sell, almost as hard to sell as a poetry collection. And I've had pressure from publishers to somehow come up with a device or a conceit that links these essays. It's almost like they want some coherent narrative, and I don't understand that really, because to me, the essay compares to a book length nonfiction, just like the short story in fiction compares to the novel. And they're both separate genres, and nobody would try to convince a short story writer to turn that into a novel, right? It's just like apples and oranges. And the public seems to prefer longer narratives over shorter ones. And that really amazes me because people do read a lot of magazine articles. So there is a market for the nonfiction short form. It's just not when you're trying to do narrative nonfiction or creative nonfiction.
Yeah, it's curious, isn't it? Um, yeah, like I'm with you. It can be a hard sell. I guess for any type of writer, I think they probably could share that experience. Well, I guess the writing process, obviously different for everybody. Um, but one of the things I'm interested in as a writer is like how the notebook or the journaling kind of in the moment writing then materializes into the more structured writing. Um, so I could speak for me, like if I am writing something in note form or journal form is very fragmented little pieces of phrases, words, maybe some lines, and it's a lot more kind of visual. Like I usually don't write in lines. It's kind of like a little more kind of like squiggles or curved lines or patterns, just visually.
Mhm.
It helps me just get something on the page, and then later I can go and pick and choose what I want to take from those notes.
Hmm.
And that usually ends up in more of a poetic form, not a narrative form. But so that's my little bit of a process there. So in your kind of like journaling and note-taking process, like what works for you? Is it detailed in the moment? Is it more reflective at the end of the day, end of the week? Do you have in mind like, yeah, I'm going to use this as you're taking notes, or is it just put it in there and we'll figure it out later kind of thing, more intuitive?
To me, I have to preface that by saying that I'm not a regular journaler, or
Yeah.
diarist. So I'm a binge writer. I have weeks or months where I don't, if I'm not, especially when I'm not on assignment, I go out into the wilderness and enjoy just being out there without having to stop every 2 minutes and taking notes, right? Because that's a totally different experience again. And so when I do sit down and write, fortunately, because of this, I never have felt writer's block in my life because I don't sit down on a daily basis and force myself to write, which a lot of writing tutorials recommend you do to develop the discipline. No, I really need to feel the urge to write, and then it really does flow. And it flows usually one step at a time. Sure, I have material that I've looked through my journals and organized it a little bit. I say that might fit under that subject or topic, and this might less. But it's really like walking. I take one step at a time, and oftentimes I don't know what the next paragraph going to be is uh, uh, about, or what it's going to look like till I get to the end of the previous paragraph. And as far as the nucleus, what can form the topic or the subject for an essay, it can be something as little. I mentioned the articles earlier already. That can be a form that gives shape to an essay, or it can just be a news tidbit, some odd bit that sticks out to me in everyday life, or a title or something. Like the other day I was thinking about or reading about Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, right? And somehow in my mind popped the importance of getting lost. And I started thinking about how that is an important experience to have when you're in the outdoors, for various reasons that I won't go into here. And so that formed the nucleus of a whole essay about my experiences about being lost in the backcountry and why it's necessary to be so sometimes and what you can learn from it. So you just never know where the inspiration is going to come from. And um, my notes are very much in the moment. And then I combine with the added research comes in where I'm trying to widen the personal experience and add like historical information or anthropological information. My essays, they're kind of dense in information. And that comes, I want to educate people about these places and these creatures that I care about and these native peoples that I've lived with and learned from, but I also want to do so in an entertaining form. I don't want to be didactic and just being a lecturer. And part of that, it comes actually from me personally, it comes out of an oral tradition, a storytelling tradition that I engaged in over the decades as a guide. To me, the essay is sort of a short nonfiction form that is an outcome of the campfire stories I've been telling, which are ideally nonfiction and not just BS. So, and as a guide, there's almost a mandate to entertain, not just to inform your clients when you have them out there. Because if you just lecture them about this flower and that flower, you're going to see their eyes glaze over within 5 minutes. So that's good training actually for a writer, and particularly for a writer in the short form. And I prefer the short form, not because I have lack of staying power or stamina or patience, but frankly, there are very few subjects that interest me to the degree that required to sit through a book length project, which usually takes years. So I've done a few, like the one about the ice bear, the cultural history of the polar bear, because that is really something that keeps my attention for 4 or 5 years. But I haven't found many subjects that have not been covered elsewhere by other writers. So that's where my preference for the essay comes from. It's an instant reward, you can
Yeah.
write it and see it published within a month and get paid if you're lucky.
Yeah, a little bit of a quicker return, I suppose. Um, Kind of an offshoot question. I don't know if you have a ready response for it, but you mentioned kind of the storytelling role within the wilderness guide or the nature guide. Is there a story did you have a favorite story to tell in that role? You know, when you were taking people on these tours, was there something that, you know, you would consider?
Well,
Um,
there's many, but one of the ones that comes to mind is my closest encounter I had with the grizzly bear, where I was on the Hula Hula River in a big raft, and I had two guys with me that I was guiding. They were in little pack rafts, you know, those little tubby looking, almost life preserver looking things. And one of the guys flips his raft in the rapid, and they had swum to shore, and the raft is his pack raft is still hanging in the rocks there. And I couldn't, my big raft, I couldn't stop that quickly, and I go around the corner, and my mind is all on now. I got these hypothermic guys on shore. I got to go back to them. So I step out of my raft, and I'm not doing what I'm normally supposed to be doing, call hey bear to alert any kind of grizzlies that are hanging out there to my presence. And sure enough, I step off the raft, and there's a big mama grizzly with two cubs, and she stands up and charges me right away. And so, uh, well, you have to, it's a long story, but that was the closest I've ever come, where I actually lay on the ground and was expecting her to tear into me. And luckily it didn't happen. And that was, of course, um, the core for an essay that's called Least Force Necessary, in which I talk about how the bear used the least force necessary to remove the threat that she perceived to her cubs. You know, she didn't violate me. She just wanted me gone or humiliated or whatever, and then she took off. But also I'm talking in that context about how we deal with bears when they become what we call problem bears, when they kill people, and then we go out and sort of in an eye for an eye, biblical revenge, we kill these animals even though they might never molest another human again. And so that was the tension that I explore in this essay. And what I took personally out of that was a learning experience. I always, one of the first things in the field that I used to do, I explain people I carry a satellite phone, so if something happens, I can call for help, you know. But I never thought about that I might actually be the one getting injured and needing help. And so after that experience, the first thing I did when we landed was I showed actually my people how to use the satellite phone, because they might be the ones that have to use it to call for help.
wow, holy cow.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty scary stuff. Um, yeah, and, you know, it is one of those, you know, something you mentioned is like, yeah, when an animal becomes a problem animal, whether it's bears or wolves or, you know, you go down the list, it's like as if they didn't exist before that.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think it's important in that story, like you had mentioned, you tie it to a little bit of a larger message
Yeah,
of
you
like, you
have
know,
that
these things.
in Nome actually, where one of the muskox, there was an incident where muskox, sometimes they get tangled up with dogs that are tied up in the backyard, and then people go in and try to break that fight up. And one, actually, a state trooper that lives in Nome got gored and got killed by muskox that way. And so there was a call for culling the herd or removing them, you know. And I always say, you know what? You knew that the wild animals live there, and actually, for a lot of us, that was part of the attraction for moving to Alaska, you know? And so problem bears, problem wolves, you might as well flip that problem on its head and call it problem people. And oftentimes you see like people in Yellowstone and other places, they walk right up for a good photo or try to feed the animals, you know, or they had a professor was killed on campus in Fairbanks a few years ago by a moose, was kicked to death on the way to the auditorium. It turned out that moose had for hours been riled up by kids who had been throwing snowballs at him, you know. So who's the problem, the moose or the people now? And you know,
Well,
in
yeah,
general, I think when you look at the state of the planet, that the answer to that question is pretty obvious of who the problem species is.
yeah, you could say, yeah, there's always like an interrelatedness to the story that it's easy to overlook if, yeah, you only pay attention to one side. Um,
And native peoples like the Inupiaq people in northern Alaska, they have a very different relationship with the animals. They're not animal lovers per se. I mean, they hunt polar bears and they hunt whales, but they also deeply, deeply respect them and have found ways to live over the millennia, have found ways to live with them in harmony or in a mutual understanding where they really reduce conflict, and they hunt them because it's absolutely necessary for their survival, physical survival, and also survival as a culture, because these animals have such spiritual and cultural significance in addition to just being nutrition. So it's a very different form of hunting than the trophy hunting or the sports hunting that we're familiar with.
Yeah, thanks for adding that as well. I think just to kind of like touch on this aspect as well. If you're if you're listening to the Wild Reef podcast, you might have heard our previous episode with an Alaskan writer whose name is Mary Beth Holloman, who we talked about her novel Bloom Again on the previous episode. And so just to make the connection there with her novel, a work of fiction, obviously, but it deals with this kind of environmental impact, kind of eco anxiety, the characters in the story, trying to work through like what can a person do, what can they do in their own kind of narrative. Um, so I guess a loose question is like, you know, we're, listeners, your audience, audience of Wild Youth Journal, they're creative people, writers and artists, and chances are somewhat connected with the natural world. Um, and so like what can a person do, as on even on an individual level? You're writing, you're communicating with people in that way. Um, as somebody who's inspired to do something, like any thoughts on that kind of
Yeah.
angle?
I've long given up on the thought or the hope that my writing would actually change minds or politics. Just think about, how many books or articles have you read where you actually went out and lived a different life because of that. And maybe it's a cumulative thing when people hear it, but then there's also that desensitization, where people, they hear the same message over and over and they turn a deaf ear to it. So I've long given up on changing the world through my writing. What I do is, and what I think is very important, is to bear witness. I bear witness to what is going on, and I have to feel good about myself. At the end of the day, when I look into the mirror, I have to live with myself, and I can say, or I have to say for myself, I did not stand by and did not say anything. I spoke up as much as I could. I don't work well in organizations, so I'm not a political activist per se. My writing is my way to protest, and without trying to preach to the choir, obviously. Also, and these stories, especially thinking about some of the lore and the stories and the knowledge and experiences of native peoples, they won't be around much longer because the native languages, a lot of them are dying out. The children or the grandchildren are oftentimes, and I've seen that as an anthropologist working out there, not interested in what the elders have to teach. And it's a real tragedy because there's a saying, with every native elder that dies, it's like a library burning down. And these things, they need to be documented just as much as the still richness and diversity that we have in animals and plants needs to be documented. And so again, I bear witness. On a personal level, what it does for me, I think the essay in particular, it is the perfect form for me to process life experiences for myself that become clear in the writing and to discover meaning. We all strive for finding meaning. What's the purpose of all this? And the writing really helps me to discover that. And maybe even if it doesn't change things, maybe it helps somebody else to discover that for themselves too. Maybe in their backyard, not through my book, but maybe it says, hey, that guy is examining his own backyard and what's going on there. I can do that. You can do that anywhere. You can do nature writing in a big city, and the same processes are taking place there still. There might be more, in a different form or weakened or something. But there's bird watching in big cities. You can do this. You can learn the same life lessons from bird watching, whether it's in Nome or out on the tundra or in New York City Central Park.
Yeah, that's a good response. I mean, yeah, I think there are a lot of things that, you know, maybe are accessible even in places that aren't considered wilderness or certainly not as remote as Alaska. Um,
I think that's actually part of the problem that we
yeah.
have segregated these areas, these regions. Like you can draw a line and say,
Mhm.
this is wilderness, which for a lot of people does not include the presence of people. And, you know, we call it wilderness. The Eskimos have called it home for thousands of years. And then we segregate wilderness from urban areas. And so we don't take care of urban areas, but it's all part. And if ecology teaches you one thing, is that it's all connected. You know, we can't just pay attention to one thing and neglect another thing and expect that things will turn out all right.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it might be a good ending note to play off of that. It was just a short quote that was in the beginning of the book from the great Derek Jensen, um, who says, finding out everything you can about the people whose land you live on and aligning yourself with its rightful owners is vital. So, I
Can
mean,
I
that just
can I
kind of,
add a quote of my own to that
oh,
that pertains kind of
absolutely.
to the kind of writing that I'm doing? And it's by Kent Ryden from a book called Mapping the Invisible Landscape, which I really recommend to writers and especially writers that are sort of interested in this interface between nature and writing. It says, to the essayist, the act of walking and thinking gives way almost reflexively to the desire to write about the terrain that has been traversed and the reflections that the terrain has sparked. Wish I'd written that.
Yeah, I think that's probably a perfect place to end things. So yeah, we'll leave the audience with that. Um, so I'll put a link to the new book in the show notes. Thanks once again for joining me, sharing your experiences, telling us a little bit about the book, of course, and where it came from. So thanks again.
Thank you, Aaron.